We're now going to talk a little bit more about how to define your own functions. So what I'm going to do is to define a function to calculate the factorial of an input, and then we'll just show that on the screen. So the first thing you need to do is to drag in a new function. So by creating one of these function blocks, it allows you to define your own function that you want to use. So when you drag the block in, it's just given a very generic name. We can select that text, and if we change it to say factorial, then you can see that it has also added a block to the library up here called factorial, so that you can create other copies of that function. So we're going to go inside the block, and you can see the only thing inside there to begin with is an output. We need to add an input to the function because our function will take an integer as an input and calculate the factorial of that integer as the output. So the first thing we want to do is add a condition. So I'm going to add an if statement, and the way we're going to calculate the factorial is to look at the input, and if the input is less than or equal to 1, we will return the value 1, and if the input is not less than or equal to 1, then we will calculate the product of the input and the factorial of one of the input minus 1. So if we start to build up that function, the first thing I'm going to do is add the condition. So I will add in a block for less than or equals, and the first thing we will connect to it is the input. Then the second input, I'm going to use an integer, and we want that integer to be 1. So we're now saying input less than or equal to 1, and that will give us a boolean, and we can connect that to the condition of our if block. Then I can reuse the output from this integer and connect that to the true part of our if block, because if our input is less than or equal to 1, we want to return 1. So now for the next part of the block, we want to return the product. So I just type in the times symbol, and this is going to, the first part of this, we will take the input minus 1. So if I add a subtraction block, then I can connect the input, and I'll copy the integer. We'll make another copy of 1, and so this will take the input and subtract 1. Then now the other product I want to connect directly to the input, because it should be, if we're greater than 1, we want to take the input and times it by the factorial of the input minus 1. So I can connect that directly to the product block. That looks a bit messy. Unfortunately, that's just because I haven't had time to work on being able to make the connections a bit neater at the moment. So what I'm going to do, just to keep the model looking nice, is use an identity function, And this, I'm only using this to sort of keep the model looking neat. I can then connect that to the product block. Now, the final part, we need to take the factorial of the input minus 1. But we've already defined our factorial, or we're in the middle of defining our factorial. But that's no problem, because we can, when we created this block, it added our user-defined function to the library over on the right hand side. So I can actually drag in the factorial block, and we can use it inside our definition of the factorial. So we're defining a recursive function, and you can see that already it has been able to infer that this factorial block takes an integer as an input and returns an integer as an output. So if I now connect this up to complete the model, we should now have a working calculation of the factorial. So if I double click to go up one level, all that remains is to connect our block. So at the moment we haven't added the input to our factorial block, so if I do that, we now have a function that takes an integer and returns an integer. I can connect that to the toString and connect 10, our input, to the factorial block, and now we've got a completed model, and I should be able to press compile, and hopefully it will show us the factorial of 10. And there we go. And you can take a look at the code and see the code that was generated to calculate that factorial.